Holy Spirit.
Thanks be to you.
Heavenly Father, we ask that you give us wisdom, give us knowledge, and help us to be disciplined during this period of time, this upcoming season of Lent that we're about to embrace. We ask that you be with us, be in our lives, and transform us in all things as you transform these popes throughout all of history. We ask that you continue to guide your church on the straight path. And we ask all of these things through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
Amen. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, Dorothy said she went online to look up College of Cardinals and she got nothing but confused. And that's probably very true because the history of the papacy is very long, over 2,000 years, and it leads a very checkered life, kind of a life of its own throughout all of that time. But it's a very beautiful time at the same place. I got this book. It's really a good book. If you get a chance, you might want to pick it up or order it off of Amazon or something. It's Mike Aquilina. He's a very good writer. He does a lot of work with the fathers of the church. He and Scott Hahn are big buddies, and they write books together all the time. This one happens to be just one of his, and it's called Good Pope, Bad Pope, Their Lives and Our Lessons. And it's very short, it's very small, but it's very detailed in that he picks out about a dozen popes, both good and what we would consider not so good. And he looks at them and the history that they were born in and shows us that the church, even though we have really great popes and some really not so great popes, has never strayed from the original charter given to St. Peter by Christ. And so I thought it was just a fantastic book, and there's a couple of things that I wanted to start us off with. The first one is really just kind of a vision of sorts. Has anybody here ever been to Rome? Okay, I've never been. You got me at a disadvantage. But this opening line comes in. It says, "When in Rome, I try to get to the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls in Rome." Has anybody ever been there?
Yeah.
You have. There one can see a long line of portraits in a frieze above the columns. Every pope, whoever reigned, has his face on the wall. A tourist can start at the current pope and walk back through the 19th century, the Renaissance, the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, the height of the Roman Empire, and finally end at St. Peter, the rock on whom Christ built his church. And I read that and I just thought, wow, that must be pretty fantastic. Did you see those portraits when you were there?
Also, the cathedral in Siena actually has heads all around, same thing.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
We did see that.
You did see that one?
Yeah.
That's pretty awesome. I thought that that was really a pretty neat vision, because there is this unbroken line of one pope to another, starting with Pope Francis today and going all the way back to St. Peter. And how the pope gets there is always of interest to everybody. How does one get to be a pope? So I thought that what I would do is I would start with that idea, but I would also start with this idea, because whenever we start talking about the popes, people always want to know about the dark side too, the Darth Vaders of the big hats, I call them. But I thought that this quote was really, really good. And this comes later on in that book. It says, "The church is a bride. The church is the bride of Christ. How Christ kept his promise to his bride, the church. He did it through sickness and through health. The great popes advanced our understanding of Christian doctrine, but what's even more remarkable is the worst ones could do nothing to damage the teachings of the church." So even though we had all of these, well, not a lot of them, but several of them that weren't so good, they didn't change the doctrine or the teaching of the church. They couldn't do it. There was enough opposition to them, over their time as Pope that they couldn't get anything done except what was in their own self-interest and had nothing to do with the church. So I thought that that was really quite remarkable, is to see that Christ has a tremendous fidelity to his church, to his bride, by guaranteeing what gets handed on from generation to generation through the popes and through the bishops. So the first question I got to ask is, when you think of the Pope, what are you actually thinking about? Who is the Pope? Anybody got any thoughts?
Bishop of Rome.
He's the Bishop of Rome. There's nothing in that one. In the church, there's 3 levels of orders. The lowest being, what I am, which is a deacon. The next one is a priest, and the third one is a bishop. Beyond bishop, you're not ordained anymore. The bishop has what we call the fullness of orders. The Pope is a bishop. And when he becomes Pope, he's not ordained a Pope. He's elected. Nowadays, he's elected. He's still a bishop, just like Bishop Sticka, or just like Archbishop Kurtz. His ordination is to the fullness of orders, which is bishop. At that, he is all 3, deacon, priest, and bishop at the same time. He doesn't lose any of the orders as he's ordained to each higher order within the hierarchy of the church. So what makes them special? Anybody? What makes
A lot
them?
more responsibility for the whole world.
A lot more responsibility for the whole world, absolutely. What else?
He's the agent of God on earth. And I think as such, he was actually sued once as that. I think, seriously, I mean, I think it was thrown out, of course, but isn't that what, he's the vicar of Christ, the agent of God on earth?
The term that the bishops use for the Pope is that he is the first among equals. The first among equals, or the servant of the servants. The first among equals, or the servant of the servants. When a man is ordained as a priest and installed as a pastor, he has a certain responsibility that he shares with his bishop. And that responsibility is the salvation of all the souls in his parish. Not just the Catholics, not just the Christians, but all souls within the boundaries of his parish. A bishop, when he is ordained, is given the responsibility for the salvation of all of the souls in his diocese. Not just the Catholics, not just the Christians, but everyone that is within his diocese. When a man is elected Pope, he is given the responsibility for the salvation of souls of the whole world. Pretty phenomenal charge, isn't it? And the way he does that is by the passing on of doctrine, the passing on of the divine teaching of the apostles. All the secret handshakes, all the knowledge, all the theology, all the teachings of the church that have been handed on one to another throughout history. It's a very beautiful thought when it comes down to it. So here in our parish of All Saints, you got 3 people praying for the salvation of your souls, which is really great all the time. You've got the priest, you've got your bishop, and you've got the pope. It's pretty phenomenal. There's probably some others too, but
Tim, to my knowledge, the Pope doesn't have full authority, to make an example, that if he wanted to ease the restrictions involving, we'll say annulment, but that has to be approved or under consideration of the Curia, is that correct? That the Pope, he has to take everything under advisement.
yes and no.
You can't have executive orders.
He can. He can have the phone and the pen.
That's right.
If he is going to issue an edict that is infallible, then he has to have the buy-in of the majority of bishops and the majority of the faithful Catholics in order to do that.
Majority of the faithful Catholics?
And the majority of the bishops.
I know that's me, but then I never voted for anything that the Pope said.
You don't vote. It's not a democracy.
It's all on paper.
It's only been done twice in the history of the church. One is the declaration, the infallible declaration of the Immaculate Conception of Mary, and the other one is the declaration of Mary's Assumption into heaven. Those are the only 2 times that a pope has spoken infallibly to the church. And in order to do that, he had about, I think, 1,800 bishops across the world, and a huge majority of the Catholics, as polled by or as understood by the bishops, saying, yes, they support this, before he made that declaration. You see, as laity, believe it or not, the Spirit rests in us too. And we have an infallible sense of faith given to us. They call it the sensus fidei, the sense of faith. And so the Pope has to take that into consideration when he makes those type of declarations. Now there's other things that the Pope can do. He can issue what they call a motu proprio. Did I say that right? Meaning by my hand. And in that, he can change things. But another Pope can come along right behind him and change them back or change them again. They don't carry as much weight as an infallible declaration.
So did the same Pope make
Yes.
those 2
Yes.
infallible?
Pius the 12th?
No, I don't think so.
John 12.
It was earlier than that.
It was in the early
Pius the
50s.
12th was Immaculate Conception.
Okay, well then it was Pius the 12th.
I
Yeah.
remember when it happened. I was in grade school.
It was in the 50s, I thought, wasn't it?
Huh?
It was in the 50s?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I was in high school, so.
So there's certain levels of things that require, the Pope isn't, he's gotta have a good relationship with his bishops. Just like a pastor has to have good relationships with his priests, and a bishop has to have good relationships with all the priests in his diocese. Otherwise, nothing ever gets done. So there's a certain hierarchy that the Bishop of Rome has to abide by. But the first one is his alone. I don't know if I spelled it right. I'm a terrible speller. He has that level of infallibility, but he has to have the consensus of the bishops and the people of God before he can do that. But he has that power, and nobody else has that power to make that declaration. The second one is dogmatic.
Richard, down to your left.
Okay? Dogmatic constitution. Do you know what a dogmatic constitution is? The word dogmatic ought to kind of kick in your thought process there. Something that expresses the dogma of the church, things that must be believed. Under John the 23rd, Pope Paul the 6th, there was a whole series of these that were issued. Dogmatic Constitution on Divine Revelation, the Dogmatic Constitution on the liturgy, the Dogmatic Constitution on the people of God. The Dogmatic there was like 16 documents, and half of them were dogmatic constitutions that came out of the Second Vatican Council. Just a whole long string of them.
And we studied all of them here.
And you studied all of them here. Lumen Gentium, Gaudium et Spes,
Dei Verbum.
Dei Verbum, there's a whole big long list. These are things that are issued by the Pope, plus a majority, a supermajority actually, of the bishops in a synod or an ecumenical council is an example of a synod. They just give it a fancier name. Okay? Then there are apostolic letters. These are written by the Pope to his bishops. Okay? In those, he instructs the other bishops. These are letters of instruction, kind of like Paul to the Corinthians. These are letters of instructions to the bishops. And there's encyclicals. Actually, apostolic letters and encyclicals are very similar, except one's written to the bishops, one's written to the people of God. An encyclical is written to the faithful. And it is a letter of instruction, some of which has binding information in it. So the encyclical that Paul VI wrote on birth control has certain binding agents to it on the people of God. Okay. And then finally, motu proprio, which is the Pope writing a letter and saying, I'm putting this in place by my own hand. He doesn't get authority to do it, but it doesn't have anything to do with changing of dogma. He can make changes as long as it doesn't affect the dogmatic teachings of the church.
Would an apostolic letter be similar to what, now, the instructions to the bishops about the changing of the annulment processes?
Yes, that's an apostolic letter.
Okay.
So to answer your question that he can't just automatically change stuff about annulments, well, he can as long as it doesn't fall under the direction of a dogmatic constitution. In other words, he can't change the part of the teaching of the church about the sanctity of marriage. But he can change a process that has to do with canon law, since canon law is part of the world. It's not a divine revelation, it's not a dogmatic teaching. It is simply canon law, which is an instrument of mankind and not an instrument of God. Does that make sense?
Okay, this brings me to really a hard question. Is that I don't remember, I can't state now when Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, but one of them quotes Jesus as saying that there is no divorce.
Correct.
Okay, how did the Catholic Church get around that?
There never was a marriage.
There never was a marriage. Marriage didn't exist to begin with.
Just because you went through the form doesn't mean you were married. in the eyes of the
Marriage
judge.
takes more than just saying I do. It takes matter and it takes form both. It takes both the man and the woman to give their consent to enter a covenant 100% out of the freedom of their will. So if there's things that cloud that will at the time of the marriage, the sacrament doesn't occur because you're missing part of the form of marriage.
This is a Catholic marriage now, if they were married,
Any marriage.
Justice of the peace.
Any marriage.
That-
Even if people getting married at the Justice of the Peace can have a sacramental marriage, as long as one of them was baptized. They're declaring something that happened as a sacrament was either a sacrament or not.
In the past few years, the changes in the liturgy, the wording, consubstantiation, etc., where would that have fallen in line?
That came out through a motu proprio of Benedict XVI, writing to the members of the Curia that are responsible for the Divine Liturgy. And he said in that motu proprio, our original translation was inaccurate. We used a translation that was called dynamic equivalence, meaning this is what it says, but we're going to put it in more easy to digest terms. And he said, no, that's not really right. I want it to be exact as close as we can get to the original language, which is called direct equivalence. And so what he did was he issued a motu proprio to the congregation on the celebration of the sacraments and divine liturgy and said, I want a new translation. So it came out of this because he can do that. Because it doesn't affect dogma. He isn't changing consubstantiation, he isn't changing the order of Mass, he isn't changing those kind of things which are dogmatic in nature through Lumen Gentium of the Second Vatican Council. What he's doing is he's saying the wording is problematic. So he can do that on his own.
For somebody who has not been around, what kind of a change was that? I'm just curious.
Well, they took the word in the Creed, was one place where they took the word one in being with the Father and changed it to the original translation from Latin, which was consubstantial with the Father.
Okay.
So that's one place. Instead it was born of the Virgin Mary, they put the original Latin term back in there, translated was incarnate of the Virgin Mary, or took on flesh. So those kind of individual words, there's little places throughout the liturgy that happened. The opening prayer, the collect, was one that changed dramatically. The collects have been in place since, I don't know, 1700s, 1800s. They were changed back to the original translation from the original Latin, so that they're more comprehensive and reflect more the Mass of the day. So that was actually the bigger change than the individual words that people stumbled on.
That was only done for the English because it had the worst translation. Everybody else has been saying that all along, is that correct?
Not true.
thought
They
it
were
was the
having
Spanish.
problems, the Spanish did not have to do it, but the Spanish language is very close to the Latin.
That's true.
So, but in some of the Germanic countries, they did have to go back and revise them heavily. Scandinavia, Sweden, Denmark had the changes. Germany itself had the changes made. The Soviet bloc had a lot of the changes made as well. Okay. So the Pope has got limits on what he can do. Now, is a Pope going to do a motu proprio according to say, no, we're just going to completely change this whole marriage process? Well, he could do it as long as it only changed things in canon law. Pope Paul VI started a motion in place to revise canon law heavily, and it was finally brought about in 1971, I think it was. That would have been John Paul II, I believe, finally issued the new Code of Canon Law, which had lots and lots and lots of changes in it. But if he just went out and did that, well, he'd have what happened at the synod, extraordinary synod on the family, half the bishops saying, time out, you can't do that, and the other half saying, yeah, but you're not going far enough. And what's going to happen then is he's going to divide the church. Well, he won't do that. He still wants to have that working relationship with his bishops. It'd be like a company president going in and saying, we're going to completely change our manufacturing policy, so we're going to have to close 15 factories. And his board of directors says, say, what? This is the first we hear of it. He can do that, maybe, but he's got some restriction on him because he still has to work with all these guys or provide them the golden parachute buyouts, right? So all of these, he works in harmony with his bishops because he is a bishop. Any questions about that? How many popes have we had?
100.
Real popes?
You know, how many
800
popes have we
something.
had?
800 and something.
264 real
Just
popes.
200?
264 real popes.
How many anti-popes have we had?
I have no idea,
And
because
there were
sometimes there was
accused.
3 and 4 at
Yeah.
a time. Felix was one.
Yeah.
Benedict the Ninth was another one.
The first John the 23rd.
John 23rd.
First
John
one.
I'm sorry?
The first John 23rd.
First
First
John,
John 23rd.
First John the 23rd. An anti-pope, just for your information, is somebody that usurps that position of pope. And throughout history, especially in the early history, we had a lot of anti-popes. Lots of them. At one time, there was 3 other popes, plus 1 real pope. So, have they always lived in Rome?
No.
Avignon, in France. They called it the Avignon captivity. So how does a bishop get made a pope? Was it always a bishop that had to be made a pope?
No.
No, wasn't. In the original scheme of things, going way back in history, there was Rome. And Rome was divided up into 7 districts. And each of those districts was administered by a deacon, believe it or not. They were the 7 deacons of Rome.
One for each hill.
Could be, I don't know. There was a physical division of the city of Rome that the deacons ran.
Yeah, the 7 hills of
The
Rome.
7 hills, they were the districts.
I'm sorry?
They were the districts.
Okay, so the 7 hills. Very good. On top of that, the earliest popes were assigned or had 7 other deacons that served them. So the original College of Cardinals, wasn't called that, were 14 deacons. And they were responsible for the wishes of the Pope to be put into practice. So in the earliest church, Peter named his successor. Anybody know who that was?
Linus.
Clement,
Okay. Thought the second one was Linus.
then Linus,
Okay.
then Cletus. There's several of them. The first popes named their successor. And it was up to these 14 cardinals or 14 cardinal deacons to see that his wishes were carried out. And they would help in the passing on of the instruction. Usually the Bishop of Rome himself would instruct his successor, but if it was like, boom, he died like right away, or the Romans came and killed him, whatever, then these deacons were also responsible for passing on the teachings of the prior pope to the new pope. So their role as teachers was more important than their role as administrators, although they became very big administrators of these 7 districts of Rome. Their responsibility, we read in the Acts of the Apostles, where people would bring their belongings and lay them at the feet of the apostles, and then it was divided up for those in need, each according to their need. Well, the apostles weren't going to sit there and do that themselves, right? And over time, the Pope would have his deacons, these 7 deacons of Rome, divide up that property that was given to the church to those in need. So that became their mission of service. Eventually, over time, that position got elevated. And we had the first instance of what they called the Roman Cardinals. And the term deacon dropped out. How many watched the election of Pope Francis on TV? And you saw them talking about, here comes the cardinal deacon, or the cardinal archdeacon, and this person is this and this person is that. They have specific roles in the election of a pope. And those roles go back to these earliest days where there was 7 cardinal deacons, or deacon cardinals, but they called them cardinal deacons, okay, representing the 7 districts of Rome. And they worked in direct support of the Bishop of Rome. That model was there for a very, very long time. So let's talk about a timeline. I'm jumping way, way ahead of myself here. Okay, the second pope was Clement of Rome. And then we have Cletus. Cletus came in 3rd, about 80 AD. And Cletus ordained 25 priests to serve Rome. That's the first ordination outside of the Acts of the Apostles that's known. And he ordained those 25 priests to serve Rome. Pope, I can't pronounce some of these guys' names. Evaristus divided Roman titles among priests and ordained 7 additional deacons to assist him personally. So we have the 7 deacons of Rome, the 25 priests of Rome, and then these 7 deacons that were put in place to serve the Pope directly.
Tim, these first popes and the deacons, you mentioned 80 AD was, that was
Cletus.
Cletus. Okay, were these basically still Jewish? Because Christianity...
They hadn't been kicked out of the synagogues yet.
Yeah, Christianity had not really,
Yes, it had.
had taken over though. I mean, Christianity was still new.
It was new, but not totally new.
Yeah, uh-huh.
Even by 80 AD, if you look at the Acts of the Apostles, and it talks about these huge numbers that the apostles baptized and converted in the early church, especially in Jerusalem and the Middle East areas. There was a big volume that was building. By this time, the apostles had all dispersed to different places in the world. St. Thomas going all the way to India, St. James into Spain and Gaul, Paul and Peter going into Rome. So there was a lot of movement going on at that time already. And they were already becoming, they started to come up on the radar of the Roman Empire pretty early on, probably about the time of Cletus. When was Nero? Somewhere in that time frame?
500.
They weren't all necessarily Jewish either, because a lot of the Greeks.
A lot of the Greeks ended up coming into that as well. Mainstream Christianity still had its Jewish roots, but a lot of the Greek culture was also involved with it because of the Roman influence, because there was a lot of Hellenistic influence in Rome, because it was Rome.
Well, and of course, Paul was the apostle to the Greeks, which was everybody who wasn't of Jewish descent.
Yeah. In 336, here we have the first actual succession or right of succession of popes. It's not until 336, and that was under Pope Mark. And he established the fact that the Bishop of Ostia, O-S-T-I-A, would be the principal consecrator of the newly elected pope. So a direct involvement in succession, other than this earliest model where the Bishop of Rome announced his own successor, now we're getting other bishops involved beginning around 336. Then we enter into a problem. Constantine comes along, right?
Yeah.
And what did he do? The first thing he issued was what? The Edict of Milan, or the Edict of Tolerance. And in that he says we're not going to kill Christians anymore. And eventually, under his reign, Christianity became the religion of the empire, the Roman Empire.